Thank you very much, Andrew, for the introduction, and hello to everyone listening in. I'd like to start by saying quite clearly that I am a big believer in the power of data to inform and to support teaching and learning. And I also strongly believe that it can positively impact educational provisions and outcomes. And I think that is a really important thing to say at the start of this and to be very clear about. And I think it's also worth saying in relation to the context that data has in some educational circles a bad name at the moment. And if you read educational publications, there have been a number of articles over the last year or two in the TES and other places that have bemoaned the increasing use of data in education. I think another indication of this is the announcement of Ofsted to begin to pull back from the hard use of data in evaluating schools to focus more on the curriculum. And I think these concerns around data, for me, come from three places. Firstly, it's about how data is used. And I think where there is too strong a focus on accountability, whether that is the accountability of the school or for individual teachers, I think that generates a concern as to what the data is being used for. And I think that leads to questions about what the purpose of using the data is in the first place. Secondly, I think there is a fear from teachers that don't understand or aren't clear or are uncertain as to what the data is. Not everyone loves numbers, and I think there are a lot of teachers that don't feel comfortable with data. And thirdly, I think there are members of the teaching staff that are concerned about the time that data takes and feel that it can be a distraction and that it is hindering, not helping what they're doing in the classroom. And I think some of these concerns are justified. And I think when data is not used effectively or data isn't used positively or there isn't a clear basis or rationale for the use of data, then I think these are the outcomes. And I think this is why there are some concerns about the use of data generally in education. But I also think it's worth saying that I think these can be overcome by schools that have a very positive approach to the use of data and have a very clear set of principles that lie beneath what they're doing that guide why they're doing that. So first of all, just to give you an overview of the presentation, I'm going to start with this theme: why I think data can be a powerful and positive force for teaching and learning and for schools. I'm going to outline our principles here at BSAC for the effective use of data. I'm then going to talk about how we use the GL products as the main basis for the external data that we use as a school. So firstly, I'll talk through what we do with CAP 4, then the progress testing, and then the past questionnaires that we'll use. As Andy has already said, there'll be an opportunity for me to ask any questions that come up during the presentation. So please feel free to enter those into the box that you've got as we move through. So first of all, as I said, I do think data can be very powerful, and I think it's important that we start to think about what it is that we're using data for and what data can do for us. So these four images, for me, summarize where data can be powerful and where data can be useful. Firstly, looking at the image at the top left, I think data can allow us to see patterns. These patterns are not easily obvious in day-to-day practice. They're not easily obvious when we talk to staff in relation to classroom practice or we're looking at a particular set of assessments. What we can do by putting data together, particularly over a period of time, is to build a clear picture. And very often we can start to see patterns. And it's those patterns in the data that allow us to focus in on areas that, without putting that data together, without being able to see those patterns, wouldn't be clear or maybe even seen by us at all. Secondly, on the back of that, look at the bottom left image. Data can allow us to shine a spotlight on things. So if we have seen an aspect of the school that we want to look at further, having a very clear set of data can give us a way in which we can investigate that clearly. Moving over to the bottom right, data, I think, also acts as a marker. So as the school moves on, as the school is on its educational journey, as the students in our classrooms, in our year groups, are moving through their educational journey, I think it's really important to look at that progress during that journey. And data points can act as those markers, a way for us to stop, to look, to evaluate. Where are we doing? How are we doing? Where are we at the moment? What do we need to do to improve? And then finally, looking at the image on the top right, data can help us to see things that are not clear or obvious about the students in our classrooms. And this very much relates to the past data. So if anybody has been to any of the sessions from GL, particularly by Matthew Savage, who talks a lot on this, he talks about past data being very effective in unmasking students. The things that we may not ordinarily see day to day and may go unseen. So I think data can do all of these things. And I think if we strip away the data sets that we have and we have access to in schools, I think it is fair to say it would be very hard to do a number of these things, or much harder certainly to do a number of these things without clear and effective sets of data. So moving on to data principles. Okay, when any school, any leader, any school leader, senior leader or data leader is looking at how they use data, I think it is really important to have a very clear set of principles that lie behind what you do. So first of all, and this is the most important aspect in all of this for me, it is to start with the why. So stealing that really from Simon Sinek, if anyone's familiar with that, it's a really important point he makes, but really in anything you do, start with the question why. If we are doing this, if we're moving ahead with data, if we're asking this of our staff, why are we doing it? What is the purpose? What is the objective? What do we want to get out of this? And for me, the answer to that question has to be to inform and improve teaching and learning in the classroom. And if that isn't the answer to the question, then we're getting something very, very wrong. If it isn't to help us to understand the educational provision that we're putting in front of students and to look at how to improve that, then the way we're approaching it, the purpose of what we're doing isn't right. So the title of the presentation, Data to Inform Teaching and Learning, is, and for me, should lie at the very, very core and heart of everything that you do in terms of data. Moving on from that, make data simple. Data, I think, and I see lots and lots of examples of this in various schools and talking to other staff, is that data can be far too complex. And this is where we get the kind of fear, I don't understand that, I can't use it. The data we use here, I think, is as simple and as clear as we can possibly make it. And that is really important, because if you want data to be meaningful, if you want staff to understand it, and you want staff to engage and use it, you need to find a way to make that data simple. And I'm going to show some examples of how we take the GAL data in the presentation today, and we try to do exactly that. Next point is to make data accessible. As a school, if you value data and you think data is important for informing teaching and learning, you need to make sure that the teachers who have the ability to put that data into practice have access to the data. So absolutely everything that we have as a school in terms of data on students is accessible to all of our staff. I don't act, the senior leadership team doesn't act as the gatekeeper of data or information. We make sure that everything is always accessible to all of our staff. Next, and this is a really important one, is to make the data manageable. I think you need to think very clearly about what your expectations are for staff. If this is going to be meaningful in the classroom, if it is going to have an impact, we need to look at how you manage it and how much data you are giving out and how much data you are collecting in. In terms of collecting data in, I'm a big believer in less is more. I think 2 to 3 times per year, so once per term at the most, is more than enough. And I would challenge any data leaders or any schools to justify to me that more than that is necessary. I think particularly when we're talking about making that data both manageable but also meaningful. If you're using data, it's coming in, you need to evaluate that data, you need to think about what you're going to do with it, you need to put that into practice in the classroom, and all of that takes time. So if we're trying to do that 6 or more times a year, I find that very hard to believe that that is either manageable or meaningful for staff. I think it's also really important to be clear with staff that external data, as valuable, as useful, as informative as it is, does not replace professional teacher judgment. And really, for me, all of the data that I talk about wraps around and it supports and informs that professional teacher judgment, but it doesn't replace it. And I think that's really important to communicate to staff. I think it's also worth, as a school, talking about the value of data. Why are you doing what you're doing? What value do you put on the data you're using? But also, what are the limitations of that data? So I'll also talk about an example of this today. I think something like target grades, GCSE indicators, most likely, whatever you want to call them, I think they can be quite useful. But I also think there are some major statistical and practical limitations to some of that data. So I think as data leads or senior leaders, we need to be very, very clear about what those limitations are. And we need to be open with staff about what they are. I also think it's well worth saying that data helps you to ask the right questions. What data doesn't do is give you back the immediate and clear answers, but it does help you to ask the right questions and focus in on that. Overall, the objective for a school, for me, is to be data informed, to be data enriched, to allow that data to guide you and to pose questions, but not to be data led, not to be led by the data in directions that you're not seeing day to day in practice and in reality in your classrooms in your school. And then coming full circle, when you evaluate what you've done and what you've got, you need to come back to the why. Have you fulfilled the purpose of the data that you were using? Has that met those objectives? Has it empowered teachers in the classroom? Has it informed teaching and learning? Has it helped you to understand and improve educational provision and potentially outcomes in your school? And again, if that isn't the outcome, then we're getting something wrong. Okay, before I move on to look at the GL data we use, I'll just very quickly give you the context of the school that we're talking about. So I'm from the British School Al Khubairat. We are a not-for-profit embassy school in Abu Dhabi. We are fully inclusive. We are not selective in any way, but we are an incredibly high-performing and successful school. We're members of HMC, IAPS, and the international associations COBIS and BSME. We moved to using GL assessments in 2016, so this is our third year of using GL. We moved previously from using University of Durham Chem. We use the CAP4 testing currently. We also use the progress testing in English, maths and science right across the school. And this year we have moved to using the PASS data, the pupil attitude to self and school, after carrying out an initial trial last year and finding that data incredibly positive and useful. So first of all, for anyone that is not currently using GL, why did we make the move? What was positive for us about it, and what has our experience been? What we like is that this is one system. It is linked right across the school. So as you can see, we're a 3 to 18 school. So our students come all the way through their early years and primary education into secondary education. Having one system that takes the students in terms of their data right across the school has been incredibly useful. Secondly, the quality of the information, the quality of the reports that can generate is fantastic. We're incredibly pleased with that, and that information is really, really useful, particularly for classroom teachers. If you look at the sections that give guidance for implications for teaching and learning for individual students on the individual reports, these things are fantastic, and our staff regularly talk about how useful they are to us. High quality support. Any issues that we've had and any in the early days, if we've been unsure about things, the GL team have been really supportive and have responded very, very quickly, and the systems are easy to use, and that isn't always the case with things that we have used in the past. It links very well and fairly seamlessly to our MIS system, which is ISAMS. And finally, and this is a really important change for us, is the speed and the quality of the data. So after completing these assessments, the CAP4 or the progress testing, we can generate that information immediately that day. Previously, we had a lag time in getting data back and getting access to that very, very quickly, particularly the CAP4 testing in the early days of the academic year has been really a positive thing for us. So firstly, to talk about our use of CAP4. So CAP4, just very quickly, for those that don't know, is a measure of developed ability. It's across the 4 batteries. We as a school test very, very early in the academic year in September. We test at the beginning of each key stage, each phase, so key stage 2, key stage 1, key stage 2, key stage 3, GCSE and A-level year 10 and year 12. And any student entering the school in any other year is tested very, very early on. When we get the CAP4 report, we do a number of important things with it. We screen for the following there in blue. So we look for low standardized scores. As I said, we are a non-selective school, so we will admit student on our entry criteria. None of those is related to their academic ability. So we get students of all abilities. For those students with a low standardized score, we will look at that. We will look at what additional support or provision that may be required. We may flag that up for further investigation in terms of learning support. We also identify students with very high standardized scores. What we're looking to do there is to support those students to ensure that they are stretched and challenged. We, particularly with an understanding of the fact that gifted and talented, more able pupils, whatever you want to call them, very often are the ones that have more issues in terms of kind of engagement and motivation. So that is very useful to us. As a school outside the UK, we have a number of students whose first language is not English, and therefore we are very, very keen to ensure that we identify any issues. So we screen for low verbal standardized score. What we're looking to do is to identify students that may need additional literacy support. So in year 7, for example, we identify students and we have an extraction program. So we have a literacy support program. Literacy is so important statistically and in terms of the evidence in students' overall academic outcomes and achievements, that we try to do everything we can. So identifying those students, and then we would probably move them on to do some reading testing. We've used this year the NGRT reading assessments at GL. We also have a Rapid Plus reading program and the accelerated reader. So we do some more diagnostic work on their reading, and then we put an intervention strategy in place. As I mentioned, some of our students do not have English as a first language. They may not have a low verbal score, but their verbal score may be significantly lower than their score in the other batteries of the CAT4 testing. We call this a verbal deficit, and we will screen for a verbal deficit which has a standardized score which is lower by more than 10 points. This would indicate to us that potentially there is an issue with EAL or maybe literacy more generally. So what we do is look to support those students. We would flag these up for staff, for literacy across the curriculum, and I'm going to show you a way in which we do that shortly in the presentation. We do a very similar thing in maths. We would look at what we call a quantitative deficit. So we look at the quantitative score, and what we particularly do, look at it against their general standardized score, but also their spatial score. So what we may be able to identify is students that have an underdeveloped ability with number, probably as a result of their educational experience, but have the ability to do much better than they currently are. So their spatial or general CAT4 scores are much higher, and therefore the maths department will put a targeted approach in to support these students. So we look to identify students that need additional support and provision through this. What we also do is we'll look at the overall cohort as a whole. As we say, as a non-selective school, our cohorts can vary. So as a senior leader, I need to think about whether the curriculum, whether the provision we have in place is appropriate for this cohort as a whole, or whether perhaps we need to make any adjustments. As I say, we would test early, and what we would look to do as a result of the information from the CAT test is to identify and flag up any relevant students to staff. We would then work to have a plan of action, any provision adjusted that needs to be, and we would have that in place by week 3 or 4 of the academic year. So again, as I mentioned before, speed is really important, and the speed in which we get the turnaround of information from GL is really very, very helpful. That means that we can take really clear early action to support those students right at the beginning of the academic year to inform teaching and learning. Beyond that, how do we use the data? We have all the data made available to staff, as I said, right from the very beginning. Right from the very beginning, we make all of the information accessible to staff. Anyone who is familiar with all the information you get from GL, though, will appreciate that that is huge, and that, again, talking earlier about making data manageable and meaningful for staff, just dropping that on your staff probably isn't an effective way of getting them to engage and use that in their classrooms. So what we do as a senior leadership team is to look at providing a very clear summary of that data. So we would give a highlights report which really focuses in on the students and the cohort issues that we have identified in summary. We summarize all of the key data, so we take that out of the Excel file and we put that into the ISAMS mark book so that staff have access to that information as they themselves are entering data, and it's in one place for them. So we carry CAP 4. We'd also take across previous attainment data. So right at the start of the academic year, our staff have a pretty clear triangle of information. So they look at previous teacher attainment and assessment, previous progress test attainment, and they would look at CAP 4 data. We do use the indicators, target grades, whatever you want to call them, because they are a good way of giving an indication, a very broad and general indication of what statistically students are likely to achieve. So we use the CAP most likely and the CAP is challenge grades, and we put those into our mark book and we put those into our tracking, which helps us evaluate student progress as the year goes on. We produce, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute, and again, this is a good example of how we try to make the data accessible. So we look at the verbal scores versus non-verbal, and we put this on a clear pivot table and a graph that every single member of staff goes in, they click on their class, and they can see any issues with verbal or literacy skills very, very clearly, which flags up to them. They need to consider how they support this student in terms of literacy in the classroom in their subjects. So when we make all this data available, what we would ask our staff is these simple questions. How do you best meet the needs of the students in front of you based on the data that has been presented? Heads of department, we would expect them to look at the data in relation to their subjects, whether their provision is right, and how they're going to meet the needs of students. Heads of year, it would flag up any students that would need close monitoring, especially in the early stages of the academic year. And as a senior leadership team, it gives us pause for thought. Have we got the provision? Have we got the support in place for this cohort of students individually? Have we picked up on every single student that needs this additional support, or maybe a differentiation or extra provision? Have we enabled all of our staff to do their job as effectively as they possibly can? This is, it's a little bit blurry, but this is the pivot table that I was talking about. And this is an example of a class. There's no real data on there. I've taken out student names, but what you can see is the plots. It plots students' verbal scores against their non-verbal scores. So really what we're looking at is students that, because of a verbal deficit, a low verbal score, may need additional support in that aspect, but are very capable are performing at a very high level. So if we look at the top left-hand quadrant of the graph there, those 3 students identified there have a lower verbal than non-verbal score. Our class teachers will need to think about how we support them in terms of literacy. So that is just a way. This doesn't come from GL. This is something we use as a school. So we take in this and we produce this for staff. And this is a way in which we try to make that data clear, easy, and meaningful to staff so that they can practically think about how they can use that in the classroom. This is really just an example of this, and here we have a student that has average or slightly above average CAT scores across 3 of the 4 bands, with the exception of their verbal score. Their verbal score we quantify as a significant difference, and therefore this student has a verbal deficit. On the graph I've just shown you there, he would be flagged up to the member of staff as having a verbal deficit, and they would be looking at how they can support him day to day in the classroom to develop that literacy in their subjects. Okay, moving on to the thorny issue of target grades or indicator grades. I think these are useful, but I would advocate using them in a very, very light touch way. So when I say light touch, for example, we do not use these with students. I think it's also really important that you think about the context of the school. This is data for a student, and looking at the if challenged grade for the student, I'll be really, really disappointed with us as a school if that's what the student achieved with us. So as a school, knowing our success and our context, they're not particularly meaningful for us. What they do is represent a kind of floor standard for us. So it is a good way of tracking, looking at those markers as students progress through their GCSE courses with us. But really, if you look at that, so let's take English language here as an example. What grade is this student going to get? So the most likely grade is a C grade. There's a 36% chance. There's a reasonable chance they get a B, 21%. The actual answer to that question is this student can get any possible grade. Anything from, there isn't A star on there, but from A star to E, anything is possible. And I think that's a really important message with this to staff. Most likely indicators are exactly that. They are a statistically most likely indicator for an average student with that CAT profile. But really, the message to students and to teaching staff is that these students can achieve anything. Any grade is possible. Any outcome is possible. So I'm particularly cautious, particularly wary on using them. I don't use them at all with students, don't discuss them with parents. I don't personally see the merits of doing that. We do use them for tracking. So we use them as a kind of floor measure. Is everything looking okay? It's a kind of minimum guide and expectation. So just to summarize that, what are we using CAT for? We're using it to personalize learning. We're looking to identify students that require support or different provision so that we can meet their needs. We are using it to track student progress, but in a kind of light way. We are looking at it from a cohort point of view, and we are using this down the line for value-added data. So using those initial indicators to see how we do as a school for our outcomes versus others statistically. And that's, for me, a much better basis for this, and much more valuable than trying to use target grades on an individual level with students. So what we don't use it for is those two things, individual target grades, and we don't use them to evaluate teacher performance it's an indicator, but it's used in a very light way. Moving on now to look at the progress tests. So as a school, we use the curriculum progress tests for English, maths and science. We find them useful because they are nationally standardized. So the results that we get allow us to see how we're doing in comparison to schools in the UK in terms of both attainment and progress. They're linked to the CAT4s and to the data there and to the previous progress tests. So what we're able to see is a data pattern over time. The combination reports that we get as a result of doing the CAT testing and the progress testing are fantastic. This gives some pretty clear progress indicators. These progress indicators are nationally standardized. So how do our students do with the same CAT score as other students do taking the progress test in comparison? It gives us as a school an objective and external measure on how we're doing. So it's really, really valuable as a tool to compare teacher assessment to as students move from the primary school in Key Stage 3. There's a long time there until students get any kind of exposure to external testing. Now the SATs have gone, so it does give a useful kind of yardstick and measure that we're able to use for that. What it allows us to do as well for those three subjects is to drill down into curriculum strengths and areas of underperformance across the curriculum. The reports allow you to look at the performance in curriculum areas, but also in specific questions. So what we say allows a maths lead or an English head of department to do is to identify any weak areas in the curriculum that they can then adapt and adjust their provision again, using this to inform educational provision and teaching and learning. This is just a quick example of the report. So one of our reports, as I said, this is nationally standardized. So what we do is we get the opportunity to look at how our students do in terms of other students across the UK. So that gives us a pretty positive picture. We get a breakdown in terms of curriculum areas. So the purple bar is how our students do. The blue bar is national average. So looking at that, a little bit weaker on problem solving might be something for the head of maths to think about, but generally, again, a very positive picture. This is where it really comes into its own for me. It's the combination report, taking the CAT4 data and the progress data together. As I said, as a non-selective school, getting a measure on how we're doing, meeting the needs of all students. So rather than just looking at raw attainment, it gives us the opportunity to look at how well our students do of a similar ability with similar starting points versus the other thousands of students that have taken these assessments in the UK and around the world. So that is really, really important and powerful data for us. As I said, on a question-by-question basis, we can see how we do against the pink line, which is national trends. So just to summarise that quickly, we are, I think, using this quite effectively to evaluate student attainment. It's really helpful in looking at this against attainment in the UK and around the world. It's really valuable in terms of student progress, so not just the attainment itself, but the fact that there's links to the CAT report to give us very clear progress indicators is really useful. We use it to evaluate our curriculum provision, and we also use it to identify individual students. So the individual version of this report gives you exactly the same information, but for individual students, so you can identify any gaps or issues in their curriculum understanding or skills that you can then pick up on It really helps across primary school and Key Stage 3 because it's some external input to allow us to evaluate. It is really useful, and I'm quite loath to put this in there, but it is really useful for inspection data. It's pretty clear, and it's unequivocal. We have an inspection next week. We've got British Schools Overseas inspection, and being able to pull this data up and put it together in a format for the inspectors is really simple to do, but it also gives me a lot of confidence that when I present the data set that I'm going to be presenting to the inspectors next week, that I can really stand behind it. It's justifiable, it's externally measured, and so on. Related to that is the progress. For me, what's really key as we evaluate the education in place is the value-added impact we're having in terms of student progression, not just year to year as the data I showed you had, but over time as well. So if we go back to starting points, end of Key Stage 2, we're looking at end of Key Stage 3, that allows us to measure the overall value-added impact that we've had as a school, which is really useful and beneficial. So last section of the presentation, and I'm drifting over my half an hour, is to talk about the past testing. As I said at the start, we are new to this as a school. First came across it when I went to one of the GL sessions by Matthew Savage, where he talked about how it can be used effectively. Sounded fantastic. We ran a trial when we got back to school with 2 year groups. The information incredibly useful. What was much more difficult with it is deciding what to do with it and how to proceed with it. So we spent a lot of time. I was set up to 2 projects with heads of year to look at how they use that practically, to set up a little bit of a toolkit and to try a few strategies. And what we saw was pretty positive in terms of the impact that had. On that basis, we moved to use this across the school. And I think it's really, really important. The data that we talked about, developability, attainment, the attainment in relation to the curriculum is all fantastic, but it only gives us the academic side of things. I think you look at whatever data in terms of student attainment, in terms of educational outcomes, and the reality is the majority of attainment cannot be explained by starting points, by developability. It's much more than that, and really what it comes down to is, in a big part, is the students themselves. It's about their attitude, it's about their engagement with school, and it is quite difficult for schools to get a clear measure of that. And the past data we found allows us to get a glimpse behind the mask, and it throws up a lot of surprises. And I think that is the right term, that it is a mask. Teenagers particularly aren't always forthcoming, might put a positive spin on things, a brave face. It isn't always easy to see, but the questions in the past survey do throw up some things that would not have been obvious to us, that we hadn't seen before, but kind of makes sense in some cases now that they've been flagged up. With the past data, I think it's really, really important how you set up the questionnaire. I think downplaying it, low stakes, dealing with it sensitively afterwards and not making it obvious that you're kind of picking up on that are all really important. But what it has allowed us to do as a school is to identify some fragile learners. And they are learners that don't have the confidence in themselves and their learning, feel a little bit insecure, feel demotivated, aren't happy at school, not many of them. The overall cohort data is incredibly positive, but it has identified some students that are fragile, some students that have barriers to learning. And when you put this together and make connections to progress testing and CAT4, so CAT4 could be high, progress results are lower for some of these students, and you put this together with this information, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. So as a set, CAT4, the curriculum progress testing and PASS testing as a set is really quite powerful. So what we've done is use it for the overall cohort data. It tells us that students have a high satisfaction with school, which is great. It's really positive, and we're happy to see that. But it does identify some students of concern. As I say, we can compare that to the other data we hold. That helps us to understand more about it. We can identify students who need support, and then we can begin to think about what kind of support we can potentially put in place for them.